special counsel Robert Mueller has concluded his investigation into alleged conspiracy or collusion between the Donald Trump campaign and Russia. And according to the outcome of the investigation, he claims that there is no evidence indicating that Trump directly colluded or the Trump campaign directly colluded with Russia. Now, the public has not seen the Mueller report yet, and it's unclear as to whether or not we will ever see the full Mueller report. But what we did receive today is the summary by Attorney General William Barr. And what I'm gonna do is go ahead and read the relevant components of Barr's memo so you can understand where he's coming from. So he writes, the special counsel obtained a number of indictments and convictions of individuals and entities in connection with his investigation, all of which have been publicly disclosed. During the course of his investigation, the special counsel also referred several matters to other offices for further action. The report does not recommend any further indictments, nor did the special counsel obtain any sealed indictments that have yet to be made public. Now, I think that's an important part of what William Barr wrote, because it does make it absolutely clear that the Mueller investigation was limited in scope. He was specifically looking at Donald Trump's relationship with Russia and whether or not collusion took place. Other issues were basically outsourced to other investigators. So there are other investigations into some of Trump's conduct, but for the purposes of alleged Russian collusion, this investigation found no such thing.
All right, so let me give further clarity and context. So in terms of the direct election interference, Mueller, if Barr is correct, which I suspect he is in this case, is clear that no, they did not find evidence of collusion or even coordination with the Russians and the Trump campaign in interfering with the election. So, okay, that part is very clear and great news for Donald Trump and for the people who believe that. Now, it does not at all clear him of any other crimes. So the talk that Attorney General Barr has of total exoneration is not remotely true. So there's a second charge of obstruction of justice we're going to get to in a second that is related to the Mueller report, but it does not address any of the other things: the emoluments clause, the self-dealing with Saudi Arabia, China, etc., the campaign finance violations, the financial fraud that happened at the Trump Organization, Trump University, Trump Foundation, etc. Those are all potential crimes. Some are very clear. Some are people are going to prison for already, etc. So when you hear total exoneration, it's very important for you to ask of what. So if it's interference in the election, then actually you are pretty close to a complete exoneration there, it appears, okay? But let's get to the obstruction of justice charge, and then there is a lot more nuance on the issue of Trump and Russia by itself.
Exactly. So just a little bit more on what Barr summarized regarding Russia. So he says the special counsel's investigation did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with Russia in its efforts to influence the 2016 US presidential election. As the report states, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities.
So that right there, that last sentence is a direct quote from the Mueller report. So that is very clear. Again, on the other hand, not on the other hand, in addition, to go back to the earlier point about the indictments that Anna brought up. So one possibility was that Mueller was going to come in and say, it's possible that crimes were committed here, but I cannot charge a sitting president. So it's up to someone else to charge him or decide whether he can be indicted or not. This did not go to that question because it didn't need to. They're saying there is, in the case of the collusion on the election itself, no underlying crime, so you don't have to determine whether a sitting president can be indicted or not. There's also no further indictments of Donald Trump Jr. Or anyone else that could have been implicated, for example, in the Trump Tower meeting. So they did meet with the Russians to try to get information from the Russians, but it appears the Russians did not give him that information, and that apparently did not cross a line, according to Mueller, on coordination, including for Donald Trump Jr., who organized that meeting. So that's a huge relief for the Trump team as well, and relevant new information we're getting.
And also, William Barr makes it clear that Robert Mueller does acknowledge that there were attempts by Russia to meddle in the election through disinformation campaigns, the very same issues that have been talked about in the news over and over again, but that the Trump administration or the Trump campaign did not directly coordinate or collude with the Russians. Now, I want to
actually, Anna, that's so important. I'm glad you brought that up, and I want to add 2 layers to that too. So for people who are now saying, oh, well, see, then Russia did not interfere in the elections, that is not what the Mueller report said. It said that the Russians did interfere with the election, and they did it through 2 different things. The Internet Research Agency, which did social media attacks on Trump's opponents, and we'll get more of the details when the actual report is filled out, but some of those folks have been indicted already. And the second part of the interference was stealing the emails from Hillary Clinton's campaign and Democratic National Committee. The Russians did do that, and people have been indicted for that second part as well. What Mueller is saying, according to Barr, is yes, they did it, but they did not coordinate with Trump while doing it. Again, that is an important exoneration for Trump.
Now, let's move on to the second part of this, which is obstruction of justice, because Trump was not only facing this investigation because of possible collusion, but obstruction of justice following his firing of James Comey, the way that he would talk or tweet about Jeff Sessions. And so here's what we know based on what William Barr has written. The special counsel did not draw a conclusion one way or the other as to whether the examined conduct constituted obstruction. Instead, for each of the relevant actions investigated, the report sets out evidence on both sides of the question and leaves unresolved what the special counsel views as difficult issues of law and fact concerning whether the president's actions and intent could be viewed as obstruction. So this is where things get very interesting. So Mueller felt that he didn't have sufficient evidence or enough to claim that, yes, Trump committed obstruction of justice. But William Barr, in reading the analysis and reading the investigation, has taken it upon himself to claim that Trump is innocent and that obstruction of justice hasn't taken place, which is interesting. So there's some question as to whether or not Mueller is okay with that. What are his perspectives on it? I mean, Mueller's been investigating Trump for possible obstruction of justice for a while now, and then William Barr comes in and says, no, I'm clearing him of obstruction of justice. So of course, members of the House Intelligence Committee, Democrats want to interview Mueller and kind of understand what his thinking was on this. Also, William Barr writes, the special counsel states that while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. Attorney General William Barr wrote that. It is in his summary of this investigation, and I want to make sure everyone's clear on that.
Democrats in the House also want to talk to William Barr to see why he immediately ruled on obstruction of justice. So let's be clear about this. While the interference in the election did happen according to Mueller, Trump did not coordinate on it or collude. But did he do obstruction of justice? And Mueller comes in with, yes, there's a lot of evidence that he did, but I don't know that I'm the guy to decide whether that evidence is overwhelming enough to charge a president.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yes.
So it's not just about whether or not the evidence is overwhelming enough. Remember, the burden of proof is extremely high when it comes to this case. So Mueller would have to prove, or prosecutors would have to prove, that Trump is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But more importantly, they have to prove intent. And that's a difficult thing to prove.
So was he saying those things because he's not that bright? Like, hey, why would you tell a national audience that you fired James Comey to stop the Russia investigation? I mean, I guess a case could be made that he is so low IQ that he said that even though it appears to be plain obstruction of justice. Okay, so there's a very reasonable explanation for all this in a second. Okay, but first we're laying out the facts. So, so Mueller says there is evidence, but I'm not the one to prosecute him for it. What we don't know yet, this is very important, is whether Mueller said Congress should decide or Department of Justice should decide or who should decide on that issue, and whether Mueller's opinion on who should decide is even that relevant, right? So what we do know is Barr then comes in and goes, well, you didn't say he definitely did it, and I'm now the Attorney General, head of the Department of Justice, so I'm going to decide in under 48 hours what you took 18 months to gather facts on and go, and by the way, he says in his report, Barr does, in his memo, said, oh no, I checked with other people. I checked with Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, so that's relevant. I also checked with other people in the department, and I read the report, and so I've concluded, no, it's definitely not obstruction of justice. I don't know that that's his decision to make. It might be if it goes to the Justice Department, he's the head of the Justice Department. It could go to Congress, which would be different, and then Barr wouldn't get to unilaterally necessarily make that decision. So that's complicated. And do I trust Barr that he had made the right judgment call on that? No, not at all, okay? And remember, the only reason Barr is the Attorney General now is as a private lawyer for no reason at all, he wrote a memo to the Attorney General saying, Donald Trump is right, the Mueller investigation is problematic, and that he doesn't see any problems with what Trump did. That was way before the Mueller report was ever handed to him. And that was before he was even nominated. So here's a guy who raised his hand out of nowhere and say, I will protect Donald Trump. That's why he's the Attorney General now. So his decision to protect Donald Trump on the obstruction of justice charge is not, it could be very important if everybody concludes he is the person who would get to decide that. But if he's not the person to decide that, then I don't really care what he thinks. Of course the Trump lackey put in charge to be a lackey is gonna conclude that despite the evidence that he thinks Trump didn't do it.
One other thing I want to add about the obstruction of justice charges, the Trump camp, specifically Trump's lawyers, have been arguing that he can't commit obstruction of justice if there was no crime committed in the first place. So Mueller's investigation has cleared Trump of the Russian collusion charges. And so Rudy Giuliani will argue, and you've probably heard this already, that, hey, well, if he hadn't committed the initial crime, then you can't obstruct justice. That is not true. It is not very likely, but it is possible to commit that crime, obstruction of justice, even if the initial crime that individual has been charged with didn't actually occur. So I want to clarify that as well. Now, go ahead, Cenk.
Yeah, on that, look, so let's finally get to what I think is happening, because unfortunately I haven't really seen this in too many other places, and as usual, it's driving me crazy that they're not pointing out what could be the most obvious answer. And so don't worry, that's what we're here. So if there was no underlying crime at all, why would you try to cover it up?
Right.
Now, and if the only thing that was related to Trump and Russia was just the narrow window of the election, and Trump didn't do anything wrong there, then I would actually agree with Barr and say, well, if there's no underlying crime, I guess he wasn't trying to cover it up, he's just being an idiot, right? But the cover up is significant and obvious. So you have him firing Comey over, you have him going ballistic over Jeff Sessions for recusing himself from the case. You have 1,000 tweets. You have cover up on top of cover up. So what's the logical explanation? There is an underlying crime. It just wasn't about the election. So what Trump was really nervous about, and that's why he said in some of the interviews, they better not investigate my business ties, which tells you, ding, 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 ding. The problem is the business ties with the Russians. That happened before the election. Now, you could say, well, Cenk, why would that be relevant? Well, that would be relevant because then the Russians know that Donald Trump, in that scenario, committed many felonies for which he would go to jail for a long time. And the Russians can turn over that compromising information anytime they want, which would then mean that after the election, the Russians could talk to the president and say, we could turn in evidence of your money laundering, or you could do what we asked you to do. Now, you don't, if you say, hey, Cenk, Mueller did not prove that, you're absolutely right. It turns out, and this is what I was really worried about, and Anna, you remember me saying this, and you guys will see it later in the program with your own eyes as well, the old videos. I said, brace for impact. It looks like Mueller did not look just into his business ties with the Russians. Yeah. If you only look at the election, I've now said, I don't know, dozens of times on the show, again, we have video evidence of that as well, saying that the election meddling was the least persuasive of all of these potential charges of Trump and the Russian connections.
You have said that repeatedly, and one thing that I've said that I worry about, and I'm definitely worried about it now, is that the way the Democrats have framed and handled this investigation and how they've focused specifically on the Russia collusion charges and how they've emphasized that over and over again is going to hurt them politically and potentially hurt the chances of a real investigation into Trump or convincing the American public that Trump has carried out possible financial crimes. So they've been focused on collusion, collusion, collusion. And after the outcome of this investigation into Russian collusion, they've lost credit, right? So as they continue investigating, which they plan on doing, not when it comes to Russian collusion, but specifically on the financial crimes, I think that they are going to be challenged a lot harsher. I think that people are gonna think that this really is a witch hunt because the American people, because of the way Democrats have framed this, are conflating the Russia investigation with the investigations into possible financial crimes. And so they've really done a disservice to the legal process and also the entire perception of these investigations.
So as usual, we have Democrats snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, because if they had talked about Donald Trump's overall criminality and emphasized that as much as Donald Trump has emphasized the reverse, then they could have framed it in a way where they said, look, the Mueller report is just investigating the election, but there are a lot of issues with Donald Trump, including a lot of issues with Donald Trump's connections to Russia that don't have to do with the election. Well, then we would have taken it in the proper context of, and the whole country would have, of the Mueller report is a small part of the overall investigations of Donald Trump. Instead, the Democrats, because they're so obsessed with losing the 2016 election and showing that, hey, it wasn't our fault, it wasn't Hillary Clinton's fault. Remember, almost every congressman in the Democratic Party backed Hillary Clinton, with very few exceptions. And they all said that Hillary Clinton was a great candidate that was definitely gonna beat Donald Trump. They all got deeply embarrassed. Afterwards, they was like, oh no, well, we would have been right, but if it wasn't for those Russians that interfered in the election. So for them, it was political. And of course, as usual, the Democrats completely bungled, even from that political way of looking at it. If you care about the policies and you care about the reality and making sure that the president is not above the law, you wouldn't be over-focused on the smallest part of the case. The only reason to do that is because you're trying to cover your own ass for losing the election. And we've also said that dozens of times on this show. So look, you're angry at the Democratic Party, I'm right there with you, brother, for totally wrong framing on this that led right into exactly what Donald Trump wants. If you say, hey, Trump was exonerated on the meddling in the elections, okay, that is apparently what the Mueller report says, no problem, okay? But if you say, hence Donald Trump didn't do anything wrong in terms of all the other criminality, no way. If you're saying Donald Trump didn't do anything wrong with the Russians overall, no way. So now, is there enough time between now and the end of his term to prove that he did actually do something wrong with the Russians? Only God knows. So there's plus a couple of other people. Two that jump to mind. There's a couple of other players. Felix Sater is going to testify on Wednesday, and he is connected to Trump, and he's also connected to the Russians. So there's peripheral players like that could be very important, and that testimony could totally upend what we're thinking today. The two most important people, though, are still outstanding. Alan Weisselberg, who's the chief financial officer of Trump Organization. Presumably, he would know all the things that Trump did. So, if not all, a lot. So we don't know what he has said so far, and we don't know to what degree Mueller looked into any of these issues. It appears not at all, because his remit was to talk just about the election. So he didn't go before the election or after the election, where I think the real events are. And so Weisselberg will be very important. And then the second set of people is the Russians. So now you might think, like, why on God's green earth at this point would the Russians, if they have incriminating evidence on Trump, ever turn it over? Because remember, the original point of the Russian meddling was chaos. They wanted to create chaos in America. Later, they were like, Trump might win? That's amazing, let's go help him, because we don't want Hillary Clinton. She will continue the sanctions on the oligarchs. And Trump, we've dealt with Trump. We've had a very positive relation with Trump. And then afterwards, did they call in those chips? Those are the things we're gonna have to decide. But could the Russians cause more chaos? Go, you know what? Here's the evidence of the money laundering. They could. Yeah. And maybe it depends on how much Donald Trump continues to play ball with them. Or he could play ball with them all the way, and then Putin can decide to mess with him and the country by revealing that evidence anyway, if I'm right. But now the likelihood of finding out before the next election has significantly decreased. The TYT Plus app is now available on iOS and Android. Download to get more TYT content at tyt.com/app.